The fall of France was not the swift collapse history remembers. Records show a nation paralyzed by political division, outdated command, and a war it did not fully understand. German victory was not inevitable. It was exploited through precision, deception, and France's own internal disarray. Newly examined archives reveal how perception became propaganda. Let's uncover the 10 facts about the fall of France that history never told in full. 1. France was not militarily inferior to Germany. The fall of France in 1940 is often described as a collapse of a weak nation before a modern war machine. But the reality is far more complex. France did not lose because it lacked weapons, manpower, or courage. It lost because its leadership misread the nature of modern warfare. At the outbreak of hostilities, France possessed nearly 2.8 million men under arms, one of the most powerful air forces in Europe, and an armored corps equipped with some of the most advanced tanks of the era. The Char B-1 and Somua S-35 were better protected and better armed than most German panzers, and French artillery remained technically and tactically sophisticated. Yet these strengths were neutralized by outdated doctrine and rigid command systems. French generals, shaped by the trauma of World War I, believed that defense and attrition would again bring victory. The Maginot Line symbolized this mindset, a monument to static warfare and a misunderstanding of mobility's new role in combat. The German offensive through the Ardennes was not foreseen as a serious threat. French war planners had dismissed the terrain as impassable for large armored formations. When the German panzer divisions broke through, French forces reacted with confusion, unable to coordinate counterattacks or redeploy reserves quickly enough to restore the line. Communications were slow, often routed through bureaucratic chains of command that delayed decisions by hours or days. Despite moments of fierce resistance, at Stonne, Gembloux, and along the Somme, France's superior firepower was rendered useless by its inability to concentrate force at decisive points. German forces, in contrast, combined radio communication, fast armor, and tactical air support into a coordinated assault that overwhelmed French defenses before they could stabilize. This was not a battle of courage versus cowardice, nor of superiority versus inferiority. It was a battle between two different centuries of military thought. France fought with the memory of 1918. Germany fought with the lessons of 1939. The truth, stripped of propaganda and humiliation, is that France's army was strong but misdirected, equipped but misused, and capable but constrained by command systems unable to respond to a new kind of war. The fall of France was not the collapse of a weak military. It was the disintegration of a rigid system unable to adapt to rapid mechanized warfare. 2. The Maginot Line did not fail. It was never defeated. Maginot Line is remembered as a grand failure, a fortress that crumbled under the German onslaught. In truth, it never fell by force. The German army simply went around it. Constructed after World War I, the Maginot Line was designed to prevent a repeat of the trench warfare catastrophe of 1914–1918. It stretched from the Swiss border to Luxembourg, an immense system of underground bunkers, artillery turrets, and living quarters capable of withstanding prolonged bombardment. Its flaw was not engineering, but geography. Political considerations and budget limits left northern France, along the Belgian frontier, without equivalent defenses. French planners expected any future war to be fought in Belgium, as in 1914, and concentrated their mobile forces there. The German command saw this and exploited it. The Ardennes, thought to be impassable for heavy armor, became the route of the main thrust. When German panzers broke through at Sedan, they bypassed the Maginot fortresses entirely. Those forts continued to fight even after France had surrendered. In many sectors, their garrisons held out for weeks after the armistice, surrendering only upon direct orders from the government. The Maginot Line did exactly what it was built to do: block a frontal German attack from the east. What failed was the French assumption that the next war would follow the last one's rules. The myth of its failure endures because it became a symbol of broader defeat. Post-war narratives needed a tangible emblem of French weakness, and the massive static line offered that image. But on a tactical level, its fortresses proved resilient, efficient, and deadly. In many instances, German troops avoided them altogether to prevent unnecessary losses. The truth is not that the Maginot Line failed, but that French leadership misused it. It was a defensive masterpiece without a strategic plan to complement it. In hindsight, it stands as a monument not to cowardice, but to the danger of preparing for the wrong kind of war. The Maginot Line was not overcome. It was outflanked, rendered irrelevant by speed and surprise rather than force or superiority. 3. French morale was not broken. Before the war began, the image of France in 1940 is often one of despair. Soldiers surrendering en masse, civilians fleeing in panic, a nation unwilling to fight. Yet the record of combat and civilian endurance reveals a society that did not collapse from cowardice, but from disorganization and shock. In the early weeks of the German invasion, French soldiers fought with remarkable resolve, especially at Hanut, Gembloux, and Montcornier, where they inflicted serious losses on German armored divisions. The French Air Force, though outnumbered, flew thousands of sorties in support of ground operations, losing hundreds of aircraft in combat. What failed was not morale, but leadership. Orders changed by the hour, units were redirected without intelligence, and communication between corps commanders broke. Down under the speed of German advances, civilian panic grew, not from unwillingness to resist, but from the chaos of collapsing infrastructure. Trains were overcrowded, supply lines disintegrated, and refugees clogged the same roads needed by retreating troops. The government's decision to evacuate Paris further fueled confusion. Yet, even in this chaos, examples of determination were common. French soldiers continued fighting isolated battles after encirclement, local militias formed spontaneously, and naval units refused to surrender their ships. The armistice was signed not because the army refused to fight, but because its leadership concluded that continued resistance was impossible under the circumstances. The myth of a nation unwilling to fight grew from post-war humiliation and political necessity. Vichy propaganda portrayed defeat as the fault of national decay. German sources used it to justify occupation, and Allied narratives found it convenient to simplify France's fall as weakness rather than structural failure. But contemporary field reports tell another story. French troops fought with discipline and bravery in engagements that often went unnoticed amid the collapse. The loss of command cohesion, not the loss of spirit, brought about defeat. France in 1940 did not surrender because it lacked courage. It surrendered because the system that directed its courage failed to function under the strain of modern war. 4. The German victory was not a result of superior numbers. A persistent belief about the 1940 campaign is that Germany's overwhelming might crushed France by sheer force of numbers. In fact, both sides were nearly equal in strength. France and its British allies fielded more divisions, more artillery, and more tanks than the attacking Germans. The difference lay in how those resources were used. German forces were organized into concentrated armored spearheads, tightly coordinated through radio communication, and supported by close air power from the Luftwaffe. French forces, by contrast, dispersed their tanks among infantry divisions as support units, a practice inherited from World War I doctrine. This dispersion diluted their striking power. The German army, numbering roughly 3 million men in the Western Offensive, faced a combined Allied force of about 3.3 million. In raw numbers, France had an advantage, but its ability to coordinate those forces was compromised by poor communication infrastructure and divided command responsibilities. The Germans achieved operational superiority by concentrating their armor in decisive sectors, particularly the Ardennes. Their attack was not numerically dominant, it was strategically concentrated. Once they breached the Meuse near Sedan, German forces advanced faster than the French could redeploy. Intelligence reports indicate that German divisions often advanced into areas devoid of enemy contact simply because the French command had not yet issued new orders. The Blitzkrieg was not about overwhelming numbers. It was about timing, communication, and synchronization. The myth of numerical superiority served as a convenient simplification after the war, used by Allied and French commentators to explain how a major power could fall so quickly. But the historical record shows that the German army won through operational innovation, not mass. Its soldiers marched longer, its tanks moved in concentrated thrusts, and its aircraft struck at command centers instead of front lines. The French army, meanwhile, fought with divided strength, more men, more weapons, but no unified purpose. The defeat of 1940 was not a triumph of size, but of system. Germany did not win because it had more soldiers. It won because it knew exactly how to use them. 5. France's defeat was decided by leadership, not soldiers. In every army, morale and performance flow from leadership. In 1940, France's downfall began not in the trenches but in the headquarters. The structure of command was fractured, slow, and dependent on outdated communication methods. Orders were transmitted through multiple bureaucratic layers, often reaching field units hours after the situation had changed. While German commanders like Guderian and Rommel operated with autonomy under mission-oriented directives, French generals waited for approval from Paris or from General Maurice Gamelin, the aging commander-in-chief who still believed in rigid control. This centralized structure paralyzed initiative. Even when French field officers saw opportunities for counterattack, they lacked authority to act without higher permission. When German armor broke through at Sedan, French reserves nearby were capable of a counterblow, yet no decisive order came until it was too late. Political leadership was equally divided. The French government in 1940 suffered from ideological fractures between those who favored continued resistance and those seeking an armistice. As the situation deteriorated, the lack of unified direction translated into hesitation on the battlefield. Meanwhile, communication between the military and civilian authorities broke down completely, leaving troops uncertain about whether to hold, retreat, or surrender. Yet the soldiers themselves did not fail. Across the front, local counterattacks demonstrated initiative and bravery. Units at Ston, for instance, changed hands 17 times in a few days of brutal fighting. These were not the actions of a demoralized army, but of one struggling against its own leadership. The German command structure, by contrast, was streamlined and dynamic. Commanders were encouraged to exploit opportunities immediately, without waiting for higher orders. This operational freedom, combined with precise intelligence from aerial reconnaissance, gave the Wehrmacht a decisive edge. The myth that France's army collapsed from cowardice overlooks this fundamental contrast. The soldiers fought, but their generals could not direct a modern war. Leadership failed to understand mobility, failed to delegate authority, and failed to adapt when the old methods broke down. France's fall was therefore not a story of national weakness. It was the consequence of strategic paralysis at the top. The lesson from 1940 endures. No amount of bravery in the field can compensate for indecision in command. 6. The British Expeditionary Force was not abandoned at Dunkirk. The story of Dunkirk has long been told as one of miraculous escape and quiet betrayal. British soldiers rescued from certain annihilation, while their French allies were left behind. The popular narrative frames it as both a triumph and a tragedy, a nation saving itself while France collapsed. Yet this simplified image conceals the reality of military coordination and the chaos of a collapsing front. The British Expeditionary Force was not abandoned to its fate, nor did Britain desert France. The evacuation at Dunkirk was a desperate joint operation, carried out under continuous pressure, in which French and British forces fought side by side until the very last day. The belief that Britain acted selfishly originated in the immediate aftermath of defeat. French propaganda during the Vichy period promoted the idea that Britain had withdrawn too early, leaving France to face destruction alone. British wartime films, eager to inspire national morale, emphasized their own endurance, inadvertently reinforcing the myth of separation. Archival military records, however, show that Dunkirk was far from a unilateral escape. Of the roughly 338,000 men evacuated between May 26 and June 4, 1940, over 120,000 were French soldiers. Rearguard actions protecting the beachhead were largely French units from the 12th and 68th Infantry Divisions, who held off German advances to allow the final ships to depart. The Royal Navy and hundreds of civilian vessels continued evacuations even after British headquarters had left. Coordination between the French Admiralty and British Command persisted until the beaches were finally overrun on June 4th. The true betrayal, if one can use that word, came not from deliberate policy but from circumstance. The impossibility of maintaining a defensive perimeter in the face of German air superiority and armored advance. French units at Dunkirk fought until their ammunition was gone, and many were captured when the last ships departed. The retreat from Dunkirk was not abandonment, but triage. a desperate effort to preserve a fighting force for the battles to come. Understanding Dunkirk this way restores historical balance. The evacuation was not the birth of British heroism alone. It was the last cooperative act of an alliance under fire. The tragedy of Dunkirk lies not in betrayal, but in the limits of what even courage and coordination could achieve under the weight of rapid collapse. 7. The armistice was a strategic decision, not a national capitulation. The armistice of June 22, 1940, is often seen as the moment France surrendered, a symbolic breaking point of national will. But the decision was neither emotional nor abrupt. It was a calculated attempt to preserve sovereignty under impossible conditions. By mid-June, organized resistance had ceased across most of the front. Paris had fallen, the army was split, and the government had relocated to Bordeaux. Yet the choice to seek an armistice was debated intensely within the cabinet. Many wanted to continue the war from North Africa. Others believed that without air or naval superiority, further fighting would destroy what remained of the French state. The misconception of total capitulation was later reinforced by Allied frustration and post-war politics. Britain needed a moral contrast to its own defiance, and the Free French under Charles de Gaulle promoted the idea that the armistice represented national betrayal rather than strategic necessity. Documents from cabinet minutes and military correspondence tell a different story. France still possessed significant overseas forces, a large navy, and colonies that could sustain further war efforts. However, the immediate concern was civilian survival. Over 10 million refugees were moving south, infrastructure had collapsed, and communication with the colonies was uncertain. Signing the armistice, in the minds of leaders like Marshal Philippe Pétain, was a way to prevent full occupation and safeguard parts of the empire. The terms agreed at Compiègne divided the country into occupied and unoccupied zones, allowing a degree of autonomy that persisted until 1942. While morally compromised, the decision preserved essential administrative structures that later supported the resistance and facilitated Allied intelligence operations. To describe it as capitulation oversimplifies the context. It was, rather, the grim recognition that France could not continue conventional warfare without destroying itself entirely. The act did not end French resistance. It transformed its form. From London to Algiers, officers and officials continued the struggle under new banners. Understanding the armistice as a strategic pause rather than surrender reshapes the moral landscape of 1940. It was a decision made under duress, not defeatism. A political maneuver within the limits imposed by occupation. History remembers it as humiliation, but the archives reveal it as reluctant preservation. 8. The Vichy regime was not the whole of France. When the armistice divided France, much of the world came to associate the name Vichy with collaboration, weakness, and moral surrender. Yet to view all of France through that lens is to misunderstand the complex structure of occupation and the duality of authority that existed from 1940 onward. The Vichy regime, headquartered in the spa town of Vichy, controlled the unoccupied southern zone until November 1942. It operated under German oversight, but retained a degree of administrative independence. The widespread belief that Vichy represented the will of the French people was a narrative encouraged by both Axis and Allied propaganda. The former to legitimize control, the latter to delegitimize the occupied nation. The truth is more fragmented. Many civil servants, military officers, and industrial leaders continued working under Vichy not out of loyalty to Germany, but to prevent full collapse of public order. Simultaneously, networks of underground resistance began forming within months of the armistice, drawing from the same bureaucratic and military circles. By 1941, French intelligence officers still in service were secretly transmitting information to London. The duality of France, one visible, one hidden, became the foundation of its eventual liberation. Evidence shows that by 1942, Vichy's cooperation with Germany was driven as much by coercion as by ideology. When German troops occupied the southern zone after the Allied landings in North Africa, the illusion of autonomy vanished. Many Vichy officials fled or defected to the resistance. To label the regime as France ignores the millions who never accepted its legitimacy. French colonies in equatorial Africa and territories in the Pacific quickly declared for the Free French, demonstrating that national continuity survived outside Vichy control. The myth of total collaboration persisted after the war as both condemnation and absolution. Condemnation of Pétain's government, absolution for the occupied population. In reality, France of 1940-1944 existed in layers: occupied, administered, resisting. Understanding this distinction clarifies that the French state did not wholly surrender its agency. It fractured, adapted, and reconstituted itself under impossible pressure. The Vichy government was one face of France, but never its entirety. Beneath the surface, another France, fragmented, silent, determined, prepared to re-emerge. 9. The French Air Force did not fail by cowardice or inaction. The role of the French Air Force in 1940 is often overshadowed by the legend of the Luftwaffe's dominance. Popular history paints a picture of French pilots outmatched, grounded, or fleeing as German bombers ruled the skies. Yet the truth buried in operational records reveals a force that fought hard, inflicted serious losses, and was undone not by cowardice, but by organization and timing. At the outbreak of the German offensive in May 1940, the Armée de l'Air possessed more than 1,500 modern aircraft, including the De Woytien D-520, Morane-Saulnier MS-406, and Bloch 152. Many of these were technologically competitive with the Messerschmitt Bf 119. The key disadvantage was not quality, but quantity and command structure. Air units were divided between Army and Air Force control, leading to confusion in deployment. Germany's Luftwaffe, by contrast, operated under a unified command with clear priorities: air superiority, close air support, and interdiction. Despite these disadvantages, French pilots flew nearly 10,000 sorties during the Battle of France, destroying over 700 German aircraft. Individual squadrons, such as Groupe de Chasse Hautfossier 3, achieved remarkable kill ratios against superior numbers. The image of inactivity stemmed from the chaos of retreat when airfields were overrun faster than they could be evacuated. Pilots frequently flew from improvised bases, short on fuel and ammunition. Many continued combat operations even after the government's departure from Paris. Archival communications show that orders to preserve aircraft for evacuation were often ignored by pilots who chose to fight to the end. The Luftwaffe's eventual air superiority came from strategic coordination, not from inherent superiority of men or machines. After the armistice, many French pilots escaped to North Africa or joined the Free French Air Forces, continuing the fight in British and later American aircraft. The myth of their early failure endured because wartime propaganda needed a simple narrative of overwhelming German dominance. In reality, the French Air Force fought with determination and competence, constrained by fragmented command and overwhelmed by speed rather than spirit. The sky over France in 1940 was contested more fiercely than memory suggests, and the bravery of those pilots became the foundation of France's later resurgence in Allied air power. 10. The fall of France redefined modern warfare. The collapse of France in 6 weeks has often been cited as a failure of national will or outdated thinking, yet its true legacy lies not in defeat, but in transformation. The campaign of 1940 reshaped global military doctrine, forcing every army in the world to reconsider mobility, coordination, and communication. The myth that France's fall represented only humiliation overlooks how its lessons directly influenced Allied success in later years. The German Blitzkrieg was not merely speed and surprise, it was a new system of combined arms: tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power working in synchronized movement. France's failure to match that integration exposed the obsolescence of rigid command hierarchies and static defenses. Within months of the armistice, British and American strategists were studying the campaign in detail. Training manuals were rewritten to emphasize flexibility, decentralized decision-making, and rapid coordination between air and ground units. Many of the very officers who had fought and lost in 1940 later contributed to Allied operations in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy, applying the painful lessons learned from defeat. The fall of France became, in effect, a laboratory for the evolution of modern warfare. It demonstrated that technology without communication was useless, that numbers without coordination meant little, and that courage could not compensate for flawed command. The The rapidity of France's defeat forced democracies to industrialize and innovate at unprecedented speed, leading to radar integration, improved radio logistics, and the development of mobile armored divisions. The consequences of 1940 extended far beyond Europe. Japan, the Soviet Union, and the United States all analyzed the campaign for insight into mechanized warfare. The myth of humiliation thus conceals a deeper truth. France's collapse changed how the world fought wars. From that failure emerged doctrines that defined the remainder of the 20th century. The soldiers who endured those 6 weeks bore witness not only to the fall of a nation, but to the birth of a new era of conflict. France's defeat, though devastating, became the blueprint for every modern army that came after. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines how nations remember themselves. The fall of France was not a story of weakness, but of misjudgment, endurance, and the quiet weight of consequence. Understanding it reminds us that truth in war is never simple, only buried. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and keep history alive.